Okay, so welcome back again to the lecture on mobile computing. So last time we discussed basic multiplexing techniques. So we have a shared wireless medium. We want to multiplex several senders who want to send concurrently onto the shared wireless medium. So we discussed time division multiplexing, space division multiplexing, and frequency division multiplexing, and also quickly code division multiplexing. So this is where we ended last time. And this time I want to discuss in more technical detail spread spectrum technologies, and I will also come back to this code division multiplexing technique. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so first of all, let's have a look at a problem that we are trying to solve here. And the problem is called narrowband interference. Okay, so what is narrowband interference? So obviously narrowband interference is interference that only affects a narrow band of your radio spectrum. So let's have a look here at the right hand side. Let's assume we have, let's say, 60 megahertz of bandwidth available. So from here to here, this is our 60 megahertz of bandwidth that we have available. Now we have multiple senders, so we somehow need to multiplex these multiple senders onto the 60 megahertz of available bandwidth. For this we need multiplexing techniques, and one multiplexing technique that we've already seen is frequency division multiplexing. So what we could do here is, with frequency division multiplexing, we could split up the 60 megahertz of bandwidth into subchannels, where each subchannel only has maybe 10 megahertz of bandwidth. So we have now 6 channels, and every channel has 10 megahertz of bandwidth. Actually, here it's also mentioned we have guard bands, so typically you would not use, let's say now 6 channels with 60 megahertz of bandwidth, but with a little bit less, such that you have here between the channels a little gap, such that the one channel does not have a lot of overspeaking with the other channel. But for the sake of simplicity, assume we have split up 60 megahertz of total bandwidth into 6 channels of each 10 megahertz bandwidth for each channel. Okay, so this is what we did so far. Now we distribute the different senders to the different channels. So some senders will send on channel 1, some on channel 2, some on channel 3, and they will be statically allocated to these channels. Okay, so this is what frequency division multiplexing so far did for us. Okay, now comes the narrowband interference. So narrowband interference is only affecting a certain portion of the 60 megahertz really. So let's assume here there's a lot of interference, and here at these places there's not such a lot of interference. So we have here the channel quality, or you could also say the signal to noise ratio. And the signal to noise ratio here is very low, and here at these places, let's say here and there it's quite high. Now what does that mean? Remember Shannon theorem. Shannon told us that we have two factors that determine the data rate. The one is the bandwidth available. Now, bandwidth available is for every channel the same. Every channel has 10 megahertz of bandwidth available. So the only difference is the signal to noise ratio. The signal to noise ratio here at channel 3 and 4 is low, and at channel 1 and 2 is high, and at channel 4 and 6 is high. That means you have a low data rate at channel 3 and 4 and a high data rate at channel 1 and 2 and 5 and 6. Okay. Now that's bad news for all the senders that we allocated to the channels 3 and 4, because they will receive a low data rate, and the other senders at the channel 1 and 2 and 5 and 6, they have a good data rate, a high data rate. Okay? Now you might say, no problem, I have an easy solution to that. Let's take the senders away from the channel 3 and 4 and put them onto the channels 1 and 2 and 5 and 6. Okay, fair enough, I say. Now, first of all, you have more disturbance, of course, now at the channels 1 and 2 and 5 and 6. So you have more interference there. So also data rate of the channels 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 goes down. Okay, that's one thing. Second thing is that narrowband interference might not always be at the same place in the radio spectrum. It might depend on a certain device that you turn on or off that is causing interference at some certain portions of the frequency spectrum. Now, if you turn on the device, then suddenly the interference here is gone. And if you turn on maybe another device, then maybe suddenly you have interference here at channel number 1 instead of the channel number 3 and 4. Or if you move with your mobile device to a different place, then narrowband interference might be more severe now at the channels 5 and 6 instead of 3 and 4. So it really depends on the time and maybe also place where your narrowband interference happens. So you see, with dynamic narrowband interference, it's very hard to manually move the senders away from one channel and move them away from the bad channels and move them to the good channels. We need some, or we want some multiplexing technique that is actually robust to this narrowband interference. Okay? So this is first of all our problem, and our goal is to find a technology, a multiplexing technology that is robust to this narrowband interference. And this is our spread spectrum technologies. Okay. So what is the idea behind spread spectrum technology? So the idea is to spread a narrowband signal into a broadband signal. So narrowband signal is, for instance, the signal that we previously sent on this 10 megahertz channel. So let's say 10 megahertz is narrow. It's a narrow band signal, okay? But we have 60 megahertz available in total, I told you. So let's take the 10 megahertz signal and spread it across the complete 60 megahertz available. What would that mean? That would mean that, of course, the signal that we spread now across the whole 60 megahertz will have a little bit of interference because, of course, some portions of the radio spectrum are not good. Here at this place, the radio spectrum is not good. Or if you go down to this figure, here also the radio spectrum at the same place is not good. So there will be interference to our spread signal that is now spread across the complete bandwidth available. However, we hope that we can find a technology that can deal with these little disturbances, with these little problems, let's say, and can recover the signal that we put in and then have still data to be received at a decent data rate that is suffering a little bit because of this narrowband interference, but not as severe as if we submitted only on the disturbed frequency channels here above. You could also say spreading the signal across the whole bandwidth gives us a more fair distribution of the interference to all the senders. Since now all the senders are using the complete frequency spectrum, then also everyone will suffer the same interference, you could say, because everyone is using the same spectrum with the same portions of the spectrum having high interference, but also the same portions of the spectrum having not such high interference. So it's a more fair distribution of the bit error rate in the end, you could say, than here in the above figure, where only the senders on the channel 3 and 4 did suffer. Now everyone suffers, but everyone suffers only a little bit. And that will bring down the data rate a little bit, since the signal to noise ratio is decreasing for everyone a little bit, instead of a very big decrease in signal to noise ratio for some senders, whereas other senders have still a quite good signal to noise ratio. So it's also a more fair distribution of the interference to all the senders, you could say. Okay, now I told you, of course, that we spread a low bandwidth signal with 10 megahertz to 60 megahertz. So we're using up the complete 60 megahertz for a 10 megahertz signal. That doesn't sound very clever, because, I mean, if you only have a 10 megahertz signal, you only want to use up 10 megahertz, not 60 megahertz. So the whole thing I told you only makes sense if everyone is doing that, basically. So everyone who used previously only 10 megahertz is now using 60 megahertz. But as a net data rate, everyone will get out only the thing corresponding to 10 megahertz. Just because I spread my signal to the complete 60 megahertz doesn't mean I have now a data rate corresponding to 60 megahertz bandwidth. No, I remain at a bandwidth for 10 megahertz. And everyone remains at this bandwidth of 10 megahertz as before. However, the interference is spread more fairly to everyone. That means that everyone can have a decent data rate, close to what you could achieve with 10 megahertz, not exactly what you can achieve with 10 megahertz, because maybe with a perfect channel with 10 megahertz, because you have a little bit of interference now for your spread signal, but still you're getting close to what you can get maybe with 10 megahertz. And it's spread fairly across all the senders. But remember, a single sender will not get out more data rate because you spread a signal. You spread a 10 megahertz signal to 60 megahertz, and what you get out is the equivalent to, let's say, your 10 megahertz signal. In an ideal case, maybe a little bit less because of the narrowband interference that is now disturbing you so little that you still can recover a lot of your signal that you have put in there. So that's basically the trick. That's the thing that we want to achieve now. And now we have to talk about the concrete technologies that actually achieve that, because first of all, it sounds like magic that everyone can send on the same frequency spectrum at the same time. So this also leads us back later on to the code division multiplexing technique that we have already heard about. And we have to learn a little bit more now how we can implement that, or how we can implement the spread spectrum technologies to deal with the problem that everyone is basically using the same radio spectrum at the same time. Okay, so let's have a look at this. Okay, so let's start with an overview of the spread spectrum technologies that we want to discuss here. So first technology is called frequency hopping. So frequency hopping is used, for instance, by the Bluetooth system or by the earlier versions of the Wi-Fi system for the lower data rates. Second technology that we want to discuss here is called direct sequence spread spectrum, which is used by newer versions of the Wi-Fi system for the higher data rates actually. Okay? So we learn about two technologies which are really used in practice today, so they are very practically relevant. Having said that, you should be aware that, for instance, newer versions of the Wi-Fi system, they use other technologies also, like the so-called orthogonal frequency division multiplexing, which obviously is a variant of frequency division multiplexing. So we split up our frequency band into subcarriers, so narrow subbands, and then we distribute our signal to the subcarriers. And the subcarriers, they have a special property. They are orthogonal to each other, so that means that we have not such a lot of interference between the subcarriers. So new versions of the Wi-Fi system use that, but direct sequence spread spectrum is used by Wi-Fi still in practice, and also frequency hopping is used by Bluetooth, so we really learn something that is used in practice today. So this is what we want to discuss here, frequency hopping and direct sequence spread spectrum. So let's start with the frequency hopping scheme. What's the idea of frequency hopping? So first of all, with frequency hopping, we split up the spectrum into narrow bands called, for instance, channels or carriers here. Okay? So again, we have several channels available. However, now we don't statically allocate one sender to one of these channels, but we dynamically let the senders hop from one frequency, from one channel to another channel in a pseudo-random fashion. That would mean, for instance, a sender would start at channel number 5 and then would jump to channel number 1, then maybe to channel number 3, then maybe to 5 again. And this is in a random fashion according to a random sequence that it will calculate. Okay? So first of all, why a random sequence? So the idea is that different senders will follow different random sequences. That would mean they hopefully would not collide while they are hopping through their sequence. However, there's still a small chance they will collide. It's not guarantees they will never collide, but its collisions happen maybe very seldomly. So maybe one sender is hopping from the channel number 1 to 2 to 3. The second sender is hopping from 2 to 1 to 3. Then they would collide, of course, if they at the same time transmit on the channel number 3. But the first two transmissions at the channel number 1 and channel number 2 for sender number 1 and sender number 2 was 2 to 1. There they didn't collide because they followed a different random sequence. Okay, so random, we have to hope they will not collide so often. However, they don't need to, let's say, talk to each other beforehand, before they decide about their random sequence. Because they are anyway random, there's only a small chance that they will collide. Okay? So random should be clear now. So what does pseudo-random actually mean? So pseudo-random means that the sender and the receiver, they can agree on a random sequence. That would mean that the receiver is tuning its receiver to the same frequencies as the sender is using for sending. So they follow the same frequency hopping sequence. So for instance, if the sender is transmitting on a channel number 1, then also the receiver should receive on the channel number 1. If the receiver is receiving on channel number 5, it will not receive the sender. So sender and receiver, they need to agree on the same random sequence. And with a pseudo-random sequence, they just need to agree on, let's say, a seed value. And from the seed value on, they can calculate the same random sequence, which to the outside world looks like a random sequence, but actually after choosing the seed value, you know exactly what will be next. So sender and receiver, they know exactly how they are hopping through these different channels. Okay, so they are sort of synchronized. So the receiver is on the same channel as the sender when the sender is transmitting. Okay, in different senders, they can use different sequences. So hopefully they will not collide so often. Okay, so that's the idea of frequency hopping. Having said that, there's two subversions or versions of frequency hopping, one called fast hopping and the other one called slow hopping. So with fast hopping, you have several frequencies, several hops per bit. That means if you want to transmit one bit as a sender, you make at least one hop to another frequency during transmission of that bit. Okay? With slow hopping, it's the other way around. You have several bits per frequency. So a sender who uses slow hopping can, for instance, send 2, 3, 5 bits or 2 frames or whatever, while being on one frequency before doing a hop to another frequency, to another channel. Okay, so this would be slow hopping. And we'll see later on what's, for instance, used then by Bluetooth. So what are now the advantages in general of frequency hopping, no matter whether you use fast or slow hopping? First of all, the narrowband interference is reduced because you jump through the different frequency bands. If one band is bad, you still have other bands available which you are really using from time to time that are good. That means some of your transmissions might have some bit errors, of course. Sometimes that might happen on the bad channels, but still you have hopefully enough good channels. And while hopping through the good channels, you have a good transmission. Yeah? So also frequency selective fading and interference is limited to a short period, because if fading of a signal is depending on the frequency, which is actually the case, then this fading will only affect the transmission on a certain band, but then you jump to another band, to another frequency, and then you have a good signal and a good transmission. Okay, so you only have short periods, let's say, where you might have a bad signal, unless the complete frequency spectrum is jammed or bad. Then of course you have a problem anyway. Second thing is, it's a quite simple implementation. It's so simple that actually, for instance, also these Bluetooth low energy devices are using that. So these very simple microcontrollers and transmitters, they can implement that scheme very easily. So therefore, it's also very nicely suited for these very little and small, cheap devices. Yeah. Thirdly, you only use a small portion of the spectrum at any time. Typically, or obviously, your frequency bands, they have a much smaller bandwidth than the complete spectrum available to you. For instance, remember my example I've made on the previous slide where I've said, yeah, you have 60 megahertz available, and now you split up the 60 megahertz in 10 megahertz bands, narrow bands. Then you're only using 10 megahertz at a time for transmission, using here frequency hopping. And that also means you can implement many senders at a time, because hopefully the different senders will be using different bands at different times. And if they sometimes collide, okay, then some bits get corrupted, maybe you have a bit error rate, of course, still there. But if you're then transmitting on some different channels, then you have again a good reception. Yeah, so these are the advantages. The disadvantage is it's not as robust as direct sequence spread spectrum actually. So this is a disadvantage. However, it's still used by, for instance, the Bluetooth devices you will find out there. Okay? Okay, so let's make an example how frequency hopping actually works. Let's assume we have to submit a certain bit sequence. So bit sequence is 0, 1, 0, 1, and 1. So it's the user data, let's say, we want to send. TB is the bit time, so this is the time it takes for transmitting one bit here. Okay, so this is the bit sequence that we want to transmit. Now here we have a slow hopping scheme with actually 3 bits per hop. That means we make a transmission of 3 bits before we change the frequency. Now again, we assume that we have 3 frequencies available here, so F1, F2, F3. So we can transmit 3 bits on one frequency per hop, let's say. So we start with a frequency F2 in a pseudo-random fashion. So by chance, it's frequency number 2. Then we first transmit a 0 bit, then a 1 bit, and then a 0 bit. So this is just a symbolic representation. If the line here, the colored line, is below the dashed line and we're transmitting a 0, The colored line is above the dashed line. We are transmitting a 1. Of course, in practice, we would have to see what kind of modulation we use here. But it's just a symbolic representation. So we first of all transmit a 0, then a 1, then a 0. And we transmit 3 bits overall while being on one frequency. And only then we make a change in a random fashion. Now, by chance, we are jumping to frequency number 3 to transmit 2 more bits. Actually, then there would come, of course, more bits than these 2. So several bits per frequency. Now with fast hopping, we make several jumps per bit. So in that example here, we start here with a frequency F1. Then we want to transmit here first a 0 bit. So we start here with a 0 on frequency 1, but while transmitting here the 0 bit, we already jump to frequency number 3. So we jump here to this frequency and transmit still the same 0 bit. This is this 0 bit here. We're transmitting that here. And then we even jump to another frequency F2 in a random fashion. And here we still transmit the same 0 bit. So we need 3 jumps per bit here. Then we go to the next bit, the bit 1 here, and then we transmit a 1 on frequency number 3, then a 1 on frequency number 2, then a 1 on frequency number 1. So this should just be a random sequence how we hop here through the different frequencies, okay? So actually we jump from that frequency to that frequency and then to that one here, sorry. So, but you get the idea. So we transmit a 1 bit here, then we jump to this frequency F1, and then we jump to the frequency F2. So 3 changes of frequency necessary for transmitting 1 bit. This is then a fast hopping scheme. Okay, so quite easy to see. Slow hopping, several bits per hop. Fast hopping, several hops per bit. So exactly the other way around. So now let's look at a practical example, Bluetooth, and also Bluetooth Low Energy as a variant of that. So with standard Bluetooth, we have 79 channels. So standard Bluetooth operating in 2.4 GHz ISM band is splitting up the 2.4 GHz ISM band ranging from 2.40 GHz to 2.48 GHz, so 80 MHz in bandwidth. We divide these 80 MHz in bandwidth into 79 channels, each channel 1 MHz in bandwidth. Okay. So this is what we do here. We divide the complete spectrum available to us, these 80 MHz, into narrow bands called channels here. So these 1 MHz channels. Now we have a hopping frequency of 1600 hops per second. But we have also to remember the data rate of standard Bluetooth is hundreds of kilobits to megabits even. So that would mean we have still slow hopping. That would mean we transmit several bits per hop. So although this might seem like a high hop rate, so we are hopping very often 1600 times per second, that still means we transmit several bits per hop, several bits per frequency, several bits per channel. So therefore it's still a slow hopping scheme used by Bluetooth. So I should say with the standard Bluetooth, because there's also Bluetooth Low Energy out there, Bluetooth Low Energy only uses 40 channels. And each channel is a little bit broader. It has now 2 MHz of bandwidth. And for advertisements, we are using 3 channels only even. So Bluetooth sensors, they advertise themselves. So they say, hello, here I am. So I'm a Bluetooth sensor and I can transmit to you the temperature, for instance, or the heart rate. If you think about a Fitbit or a fitness tracker channel. So in order to find such a sensor, the receiver has to listen on the frequencies. And if the sender is hopping through the frequencies, through the bands, through the channels, then it's quite hard maybe for the receiver to figure out where the sender is actually. And that there's really a temperature sensor around. So in order to increase the chance that, let's say, the receiver sees the advertisements of the sender, here in Bluetooth Low Energy, we only use 3 channels for advertisements. The channel number 37, 38, and 39. That means the receiver side doesn't need to search so many channels to discover a certain Bluetooth Low Energy device, like a fitness tracker or a temperature sensor or whatever. Bluetooth also implements here an adaptive scheme for detecting bad channels. So there might be some channels which are really bad because there might be narrowband interference on these channels. And of course, frequency hopping makes sure that we do not only use the bad channels, but also sometimes the good channels. But why not also exclude the bad channels altogether if the bad channels are bad for a long time? So if you already know that on certain channels, for instance, there's a Wi-Fi access point on the same channels, then we might need to or want to exclude these channels altogether because there's anyway only bad channels in that frequency range where there's maybe the Wi-Fi access point. In order to avoid that, Bluetooth implements two schemes for that. One based on the received signal strength indicator. You could say the Bluetooth devices, they are measuring the signal to noise ratio, and on channels where the signal strength is very low compared to the noise level, they would avoid these channels and only jump between the good channels, which increases their chance of anyway having a good transmission. Also maybe wasting a little bit of bandwidth because maybe the bad channels are not bad all the time, or they're not really bad, not very bad, let's say, but only a little bit bad. Then of course you would waste a little bit bandwidth maybe on these channels, at least if you have many transceivers at the same time. But still, if these are really bad channels, then it's maybe a good idea to completely avoid them, using maybe the received signal strength indicator, RSSI, or the packet error rate. So if you realize that you cannot transmit a complete packet, a complete frame without an error, then you might want to avoid that channel because you might not be able to recover from these bit errors then. That might mean you have a frame which is garbage anyway, and then you want to avoid these channels where you can only transmit garbage frames. So what I want to say here is, without going into very much technical detail, you can implement an adaptive scheme, figuring out which channels are bad, and then you simply generate random number sequences, which are really avoiding these bad channels, and they're only hopping through the good channels. And if there's still some narrowband interference also on the good channels, so that they are not good all the time, but sometimes they're good, sometimes they are bad, then you still have the robustness which you get anyway from frequency hopping. So that is what Bluetooth is basically implementing. Okay, so next I want to do a little experiment. I want to show you the frequency hopping is done by Bluetooth. So the setup of our experiment is as follows. We have a Bluetooth speaker here. The Bluetooth speaker is connected wirelessly, obviously by Bluetooth, here to the smartphone. The smartphone will play some music here to the Bluetooth speaker. And then we use the software-defined radio to watch the communication going on between the smartphone and the Bluetooth speaker. And hopefully we can see then the frequency hopping done by Bluetooth. So let's switch on the Bluetooth speaker. Okay, so the Bluetooth speaker is now connected to a smartphone. Now we can play some music. I have selected some free music using the Creative Commons license, so I should mention the authors. It's the Symphony Orchestra, playing the New World Symphony by Dvorak. Let's jump directly into the finals. Okay, so that's a New World Symphony by Dvorak. So this shows us the setup is really working. So there's Bluetooth communication now between the smartphone and here the Bluetooth speaker. And now we can use the software-defined radio to watch the communication going on between the smartphone and the Bluetooth speaker. Okay, so in this experiment, I want to use the GNU Radio software to show you the communication going on between the smartphone and the Bluetooth speaker. So here we have a component for the software-defined radio. Software-defined radio is tuned in at 2.44 gigahertz, so right in the middle of the ISM band, which ranges from roughly 2.4 gigahertz to 2.48 gigahertz, so it's 80 megahertz in bandwidth. We also sample here the ISM band with a certain bandwidth. We sample it with a 40 megahertz bandwidth because of restrictions also of my software-defined radio. I cannot sample the complete ISM band at once, which is 80 megahertz in bandwidth. So we're only sampling half of the ISM band at once, basically. But that should be enough to show you the frequency hopping as done by Bluetooth, actually. But you should be aware we're only seeing half of the ISM band now. Okay, so we sample the ISM band and then we send these samples to GUI elements, a waterfall sync to show you the signal over time, and a frequency sync to show you the current signal, let's say. Okay, so let's start a software-defined radio. And then you can already see the communication at 2.4 gigahertz ISM band. So center frequency is 2.44 gigahertz, that's right here in the middle. To the left we have 20 megahertz in bandwidth, and to the right we have 20 megahertz in bandwidth. So basically we're going down to 2.42 gigahertz and up to 2.46 gigahertz, but you should be aware ISM band is going on further to the left to 2.40 gigahertz and 2.48 gigahertz here to the right. So we're only seeing a portion of the ISM band, but we already can see some communication going on. Here, all these horizontal lines, they're basically communication. It's a little bit of stronger communication here, but this is no Bluetooth communication. This is maybe Wi-Fi communication that we see here, because remember, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi share the same ISM band. This is Wi-Fi communication, and if you see Bluetooth communication in a minute, we see it looks completely different, basically. Yeah? So of course I cannot switch off Wi-Fi completely, because first of all I cannot switch off the Wi-Fi networks of my neighbors, clearly. Yeah? Secondly, I need myself Wi-Fi communication for streaming the music to my smartphone. Then from the smartphone, it's then streamed by Bluetooth to my Bluetooth speaker. So I need myself Wi-Fi and Bluetooth basically at the same time. Okay, so let's start Bluetooth, and then let's see how this display here and also this display down here will change. So let's start the music. Bluetooth speaker. Okay, so now Bluetooth is really streaming the music from the smartphone to the Bluetooth speaker. So let me turn down the volume maybe a little bit of the music, such that you can hear me a little bit better. So what do we see now here? We see these little horizontal lines up here, which jump all over the place. This is exactly Bluetooth communication with frequency hopping. So you see here, this little horizontal line is basically here on the left side of the spectrum. We see here to the right hand side of the spectrum little horizontal lines. We see it in the middle of the spectrum. We see it basically really everywhere. And this is Bluetooth doing frequency hopping. We can also see that down here in the frequency spectrum. In the current signal, you see all these peaks jumping up at different places. This is the Bluetooth communication, hopping between the different frequencies. And these peaks, they're quite narrow in bandwidth. They're only 1 megahertz in bandwidth because Bluetooth splits up the ISM band in 1 megahertz bands. And then it jumps between these 1 megahertz bands. So basically every tick here is a 1 megahertz band. You see, for instance, here this little horizontal line is centered around this 1 megahertz band here. This little horizontal line is right in the middle at 2.44 gigahertz. This horizontal line here is centered around this 1 megahertz band here. So communication is really jumping around between these 1 megahertz bands. And these 1 megahertz bands are distributed all over the ISM bands. You see, they're also jumping into areas where we have Wi-Fi communication going on. So for instance, here there's a lot of Wi-Fi communication going on. And certainly here in these bands that overlap with this Wi-Fi communication here, signal to noise ratio is much worse maybe than maybe here to the left-hand side, where we have much lesser Wi-Fi communication going on. But still, frequency hopping jumps all through these bands here. And maybe here there's some lower signal to noise ratio, some worse reception, let's say, and here's some better reception. But this is exactly the idea, that you get a little bit more tolerant, robust to this interference by jumping between the different frequency bands. If you always stayed within this band here, for instance, you would always have a bad signal to noise ratio. If you now sometimes jump here to the left hand side and to other bands, you at least sometimes have a good signal to noise ratio and can better decode your signal. And anyway, also you see Wi-Fi is not always active. It's always also only sending from time to time, okay? But you see now very clearly the frequency hopping done by Bluetooth. Actually, I cannot show you the complete frequency hopping because frequency hopping is jumping at a very high rate in Bluetooth at 1600 times per second. What you see here is only a subset of these jumps, let's say, from Bluetooth. But still, I think it's enough to show you that here we're jumping between the bands and we have really frequency hopping implemented by the Bluetooth system. So if I stop now here the Bluetooth speaker, anyway, music is here quite silent right now. So now it's completely silent because it's turned off. And now you see also Bluetooth communication has stopped. There's no little horizontal lines jumping anymore between the different places in the spectrum. If I turn it on again, so now music is turned on again, you might hardly hear it because it's New World Symphony is right now quite silent actually. So you see, again, here's these little horizontal lines which now again jump all over the place. So again, frequency hopping done by Bluetooth. Okay, I think that very nicely shows that Bluetooth is really using frequency hopping, jumping all over the place in the ISM band. So let's go to the second spread spectrum technology called direct sequence spread spectrum. So what's the principle of that technology? Now for this technology, really all the senders send on the same frequency and probably at the same time. And the channel which they use is really a broadband channel in contrast to the low bandwidth channels that frequency hopping actually used. So this is really completely different from frequency hopping. So with frequency hopping, senders send on small bandwidth channels, and we hope that no two senders send at the same time on the same channel by using a random sequence for the channel hopping. Okay? So this was frequency hopping. Now we do it differently. Now we let all the senders use the complete broadband channel assigned to them at the same time and let them send at the same time. So this is completely different from what frequency hopping actually does. Now you could say, okay, now every sender uses the complete bandwidth of the complete channel at a time, so it has possibly a higher data rate. But actually that's not really true. And you will realize that also when you see it in the next slide how that's really implemented. But what we here do is we spread a low bandwidth signal to a broadband signal. So the net data rate only depends on the bandwidth of the low bandwidth signal. Just by spreading the low bandwidth signal to the broadband signal will not increase the net data rate, because basically we are still sending the low bandwidth signal just converted to a broadband signal. So what we hope by doing this is we want to increase robustness. That means the broadband signal should be more robust to narrowband interference than the low bandwidth signal. However, the data rate will not really increase compared to the low bandwidth signal because we just spread the low bandwidth signal to a broadband signal, which is then more robust. And all the senders can then use the broadband channel at the same time. So, okay. So there is no magic going on here, giving every sender more data rate than before. That would be really magic, because the net bandwidth is still the bandwidth of the complete broadband channel that you have available. And if you have multiple senders at the same time, they will also share the bandwidth. So they cannot magically gain more than the channel can actually transport, let's say, according to Shannon. So you have to remember that we spread a low bandwidth signal to a broadband signal, and the net data rate depends on the low bandwidth signal, but the robustness to interference will increase by spreading that low bandwidth signal to the broadband signal. So now a little bit more technically, each sender is now using a unique code. So that brings us back to code division multiplexing. So now really every sender has a unique code, and when a sender wants to send, it multiplies its low bandwidth signal by this code, and this is doing then basically the spreading. That means we get a broadband signal by multiplying our low bandwidth signal with the code, and we'll later on see why this will really increase the bandwidth, but that's actually the spreading process. So the receiver then, on the other hand, the receiver will receive a mixture of all the sender signals at the same time. Because basically all the signals from all the senders who are now really sending at the same time will add up in the air, you could say, at a receiver side. So the receiver, first of all, receives a broadband signal, which is a mixture of all the signals sent out by the different senders concurrently. Okay? However, the receiver wants to tune into the signal of a particular sender only. So it can do that by knowing the code of that particular sender and again multiplying the combined signal from all the senders with the specific code of a particular sender. That would cancel out all the signals from the other senders that the receiver does not want to receive from, and will leave us only with a signal of the one sender that the receiver actually wants to receive. So you might remember my little scenario that I presented to you when we talked about code division multiplexing. There I talked about different people speaking at the same time in different languages. For instance, a French-speaking guy and a Spanish-speaking guy, they speak at the same time. Also their speech, their sound will add up in the air. Here's acoustic signals, of course, but also they will mix, and you will receive with your ear the mixture of both of them talking at the same time. okay? But you can filter out the speech of the French-speaking guy by understanding the code of this French-speaking guy, which is actually the French language in that example. Yeah? Now, of course, here we have it more technically, so we need really a code which we can multiply the signal with, and that leaves us only with the information, the signal from the one sender that we want to receive from. So this is then the despreading process, because that will also at the same time convert the broadband signal again back to the low bandwidth signal that actually the sender wanted to send in the first place. Huh? So this is then the despreading. We go back from the broadband signal to a low bandwidth signal. So in the next slides, we'll then see how that actually works really more technically in detail. Okay, so let's look at that process in more technical detail. So in order to implement this direct sequence spread spectrum technology, we first of all need to assign a unique code to each sender. And that code we call the chipping sequence of that sender. So we need to assign a unique chipping sequence to each sender. So for instance, here on the right hand side, we see a sender, and the sender has been assigned a chipping sequence 0 chip, 1 chip, 1 chip, 0, 1, 0, 1. So this is the chipping sequence of that particular sender, which is at the same time the unique code of that sender. So chips are different from bits. Bits is actually the data that the sender wants to send. So this is, you could say, the low bandwidth signal that the sender wants to send. This is the bit sequence. So here we want to send a 1 bit, and then we want to send a 0 bit. So this is the user data, the low bandwidth signal that the sender actually wants to send. So now if the sender wants to send that data, that low bandwidth signal, it needs to spread it to a broadband signal. And it does that by multiplying the bit sequence with its chipping sequence. In order to send a 1 bit, we send the chipping sequence as it is. So if you want to send a 1, we send out 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. This is exactly the chipping sequence of that particular sender. And if that sender wants to send a 0, it sends the inverse, the complement of its chipping sequence. So if it wants to send here the 0 bit, it is sending actually the signal 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. So this is exactly the inverse of the chipping sequence of the sender. So this is the original chipping sequence of the sender. This is the complement, the inverse of that chipping sequence. And if you want to send a 0 bit, we need to send the inverse. If you want to send a 1 bit, then we send the chipping sequence as it is. Okay? So this is what the sender actually does in order to spread its signal. So now it should also become clear why we need now m times the bandwidth than before. Because in order to send a single bit, we need to send m chips. Yeah? So we send a single bit here, but the signal that we actually send out is m times longer, you could say, or has m times the rate of that original signal, the low bandwidth signal. So we need m times the bandwidth for the spread signal. Yeah? So the spread signal needs m times the bandwidth because we send m times bits for each single bit that we want to send out. Okay, so this process is then called spreading because we spread a single bit to an m bit chipping sequence here in that example to 7 bits. So we need seven times the bandwidth to send the spread signal in comparison to the low bandwidth original signal, which is consisting then of the bits. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Okay, now in order for making code division multiplexing work, we need a special property for our code. That means the chipping sequences assigned to the different senders, they need to have a special property. And this property is that all the chipping sequences assigned to the different senders must be pairwise orthogonal. Now in order to show you and to define what pairwise orthogonal actually means, I first of all switch now to a bipolar notation. That means instead of using a 0 chip, I will use a -1 chip. A 1 remains a 1, but a 0 becomes a -1. Okay, taking for example here this chipping sequence, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0 now becomes -1, 1, 1, -1, -1. Okay? And in this bipolar notation, I now can really start calculating. And now I can first of all define what orthogonal actually means. Let's take two chipping sequences, S and T, and look and define what orthogonal means. What does it mean that S and T are orthogonal? We say S and T are orthogonal if their inner product is 0. Now, what is the inner product of two chipping sequences? S and T here. So here's the inner product, and this is the definition of the inner product. So we first of all take the first chip of the chipping sequence S and the first chip of the chipping sequence T and multiply it. Take the product of these first chips. Okay? Then we add to this the product of the second chips of S and T. That means we take the second chip of S, the second chip of T, multiply it and add it to the sum. Then we do the same for the third chips of S and T, add it to the sum. Then we take the product of the fourth chips of S and T and add it to the sum. And so on, until we have summed up all the products of the chips. And then we divide it by m, by the numbers of chips in the chipping sequence. And that's the definition of the inner product. Now, what does it mean that two chipping sequences are orthogonal? This means the inner product is 0. Now, that might remind you of something you might have already learned at school. If you have two vectors in Euclidean space, for instance, a three-dimensional space, how do you check whether these two vectors are orthogonal? What do you do there? You calculate a so-called dot product of these two vectors. And the dot product, if you remember that from school, it's very similarly defined as this one here, the inner product of our two chipping sequences. Now, when are two vectors in Euclidean space orthogonal, then you get a dot product of what value? Of 0. That means if the dot product of two vectors is 0, then the two vectors are orthogonal in Euclidean space. It's exactly the same idea here for our chipping sequences. If two chipping sequences are orthogonal, then their inner product as defined here is also 0. So inner product 0 means the two chipping sequences are orthogonal. Okay, now having the definition of being orthogonal, or two chipping sequences being orthogonal, we can make some observations. Our first observation is if two chipping sequences S and T are 0 with their inner product, then also the inner product of S and the inverse of T is actually 0. So why that? It's quite easy maybe to see if you imagine that definition here of the inner product. And let's take first of all, for instance, the first chips of S and T and assume the first chips of S and T, they are both 1. Then you would multiply 1 by 1. What do you get? 1. Now if you take the inverse of T, then the first chip of T would become minus 1. Previously it was 1, now it becomes minus 1. Now what do? You multiply again 1 by now minus 1. So now you get a minus 1. Previously you get a 1, now you get minus 1. Same way around, if you previously had here a product for two chips of minus 1, you will now get a 1 if you take the inverse of the one chipping sequence. Okay? That means now instead of, for instance, summing up 1 plus minus 1 equals 0, you now sum up minus 1 plus 1, and this is also 0. So it's quite easy to see that if you have an inner product of two chipping sequences being 0, then also the inner product of S and the inverse of the chipping sequence of T is also 0. Now, why is that important? Remember from the previous slides that I told you that if a sender wants to send a 0 bit, it will send the inverse of the chipping sequence. So it's very important that senders do not only send their chipping sequence, but also the inverse of their chipping sequence. And if you want to filter out signals from senders that we actually do not want to listen to, that we do not want to really receive and decode, then we need to be sure that also the inner product of a chipping sequence and the inverse of another chipping sequence is actually 0. So this is very important because senders send their chipping sequence and sometimes also the inverse of their chipping sequence if they want to send a 0 bit. Okay? So that's the first observation to make. Second observation to make is that if we take the inner product of S and S itself, we get a 1. So I think that's also quite easy to see because what do we do here? Assume the first chip of S is 1. Then what do? We multiply 1 by 1. What do we get? 1. Assume the second chip maybe of S is minus 1. Then what do we calculate here? We calculate minus 1 multiplied by minus 1. What is that? Again 1. So basically what we do is we sum up all the chips to m times 1. So this would be m times 1. So what do we get? M. And if we divide m by m, we get 1. That's quite straightforward to see maybe. Now, if that is true here, if we multiply s by s and we get 1, then this is also true here. If you take the inner product of s and the inverse of s, we get minus 1. Also quite easy to imagine, I think. Assume that the first chip of s is 1. Then the inverse of 1 would be minus 1. So what do we do here? If you take the product, we multiply 1 by minus 1. What do we get? Minus 1. Now if the first chip of s was minus 1, then we would multiply minus 1 by 1, because if we take the inverse of minus 1, it would be 1. Okay? So we always have minus 1 as a result of this multiplication here. Then in the end we would sum up m times minus 1. Okay, what is m times minus 1? It's minus m. Okay, if we divide minus m by m, what do we get? Minus 1. So minus m divided by m is minus 1. So that's the second observation, or actually third observation to make. If you multiply s by the inverse of s, we get minus 1. Second observation to make was if you multiply s by s, we get 1. Now why is that important? This is important such that the receiver can filter out, get the signal of a particular sender from the mixture of signals, from the sum of signals that it receives. Because what the receiver will do is, the receiver will multiply the received signal by the chipping sequence of the sender that it actually wants to receive. So what it actually does is, if the sender was sending a 1, then sender was sending the chipping sequence S, receiver would multiply that by S. So what would it get in the end? It would get a 1. That's exactly the despreading. Yeah, so that's the despreading done by the receiver for the signal of S. Now, if the sender sent the inverse of S because it wanted to send a 0 bit, and the receiver multiplies that by S, it will get a minus 1, which then corresponds to a 0 bit. So that's again the despreading, now with the inverse chipping sequence. And then you get a minus 1, which then corresponds to a 0 bit. So it is exactly what the receiver is doing to get a signal of a particular sender. It will multiply by the chipping sequence of that particular sender. And the sender might send either the chipping sequence S or the inverse of the chipping sequence S. So therefore it's important that we get 1 or minus 1 if we do this multiplication here. Okay, so what does a sender now actually do in order to transmit a 0 bit or a 1 bit? So how is the signal spreading actually working? Okay, so first of all, we assume that every sender has a certain chipping sequence, which is, as said before, orthogonal with all the chipping sequences used by other senders. And if a sender wants to send a 1 bit, it will just send its chipping sequence. And if it wants to send a 0 bit, it will send a complement, the inverse of its chipping sequence. It can also be silent. It doesn't need to send anything. However, if it wants to send a 1, it will send a chipping sequence. If it wants to send a 0, it sends the inverse of the chipping sequence. We also make the assumption that if multiple transmitters transmit at the same time, then their signals will linearly add up at the receiver side. So if two transmitters transmit at the same time, their signals will add up basically in the air at the receiver side. And we assume that the receiver will receive the signals from the several senders that it will be receiving at the same time with the same signal strength. This is already not trivial anymore, because for that we need later on regulation of the power, the transmission power of the different senders, such that at a receiver side you will always receive the same signal strength no matter whether a sender is very far away from you or very close to you. So for this we need to regulate the transmission power. That's already not trivial. But let's assume for now that the signals at the receiver side from each sender have the same strength. Then these signals will simply add up. Here we have a simple example. We have here the one chipping sequence and another chipping sequence of our second sender. And we can simply do the addition of these chipping sequences to get a final signal which is then actually received at the receiver. So if two senders send at the same time a -1, then the receiver will receive -2. So the two signals, -1 and -1, they simply add up. And what the receiver receives is the addition of that, so -2. If the one sender is sending a -1 in its chipping sequence and the other one +1, then what the receiver will receive is 0. So these two signals here, these two chips will basically cancel out. If you send here at the sender 1 a 1 and the sender 2 a 1, then the receiver will receive +2. Okay? So the signals of the different transmitters transmitting at the same time, they will simply add up linearly, and the receiver will receive the sum of these signals. Okay? We can also make a little bit a bigger example. So here we have 4 transmitters, senders A, B, C, and D. We also see their chipping sequences. And in bipolar notation, we see the chipping sequences on the right-hand side. Okay? So now we have different scenarios. Scenario number 1 would be only C is sending. Only the sender C is active. And it's sending a 1 bit. So how to read that is sender A is silent, sender B is silent, sender C is sending a 1 bit, and sender D is silent. Okay, so what do we see then at the receiver side? We only see the chipping sequence of C. So this is the chipping sequence of C. This is exactly what we also receive at the receiver side. Now, if both B and C are active at the same time, and both B and C are sending a 1 bit, then we have an addition of the chipping sequence of B and C at the receiver side. So we get -1 plus -1 is -2, -1 plus 1 is 0, and so on and so on. And this is then the signal received at the receiver side if only B and C are sending at a time and both of them are sending a 1 bit. Then we have different other scenarios. A is active, sending a 1 bit, and B is active, sending a 0 bit. Then we would have the signal of the chipping sequence of A and the inverse of the chipping sequence of B. So here, chipping sequence of A in the inverse of the chipping sequence of B. So we have to invert that. So this -1 becomes a 1. So we have 1 plus -1, that should be 0 then. So here we have then the 0, okay? Here C and D are silent, so we don't need to consider them. And now we can make many different scenarios. We later will continue with this example, but for now I think it's clear. The signals of the different senders who are active at the same time, they will simply add up, and either the senders are sending their chipping sequence if they want to send a 1 bit, or the inverse of their chipping sequence if they want to send a 0 bit. Okay? Okay, so how does a receiver actually decode now only the information from a specific sender, or let's say from a specific logical channel that it wants to receive? Let's say C is the chipping sequence of the sender that actually the receiver wants to decode the information from. Then the receiver will receive a signal which is the sum of all the signals sent out by the different senders concurrently. So this is what's called S here. So S is basically the sum of all the signals sent out by the different senders concurrently. So either the senders send their chipping sequence of their specific channel, or they will send their inverse of their chipping sequence. And all these signals will add up, and then you will receive, or the receiver will receive, the sum of all these signals. Now, the receiver is only interested in the information from the channel C with the chipping sequence C. In order to decode only the information from C, it will multiply the received signal with the chipping sequence of that specific channel that it actually wants to receive. So it calculates the inner product of S and C. And this should give us then only the information sent on the channel C with a chipping sequence C. Now the question is, of course, why does this actually work? Okay, so the question is, why does this actually work? So why can the receiver filter out from the signal that it receives from this S only the information of a certain channel, here in that example C. Huh? So let's make a little example here. Let's assume we have 3 different senders, A, B, and C, or 3 different channels, A, B, and C, who are transmitting concurrently at the same time. So on a channel A and C, there's a 1-bit transmitted, and on this channel B, there's a 0-bit transmitted. That means we're sending on a channel A the chipping sequence of A, on channel C the chipping sequence of C, and on channel B the inverse of the chipping sequence of B. So the sum of the signals should be the chipping sequence A plus the inverse of the chipping sequence B plus the chipping sequence C. Okay, so now the receiver just wants to receive what's sent on the channel C. Okay, and to this end, the receiver will multiply the signal S by the chipping sequence C. So it computes here the inner product of S and C. And if we expand that a little bit, it looks like this. We have the chipping sequence A plus the inverse of the chipping sequence B plus the chipping sequence C. And we take of that sum here the inner product with C. Okay? Now, if we do that, then we also calculate the inner product of the chipping sequence A and the chipping sequence C. And we already know that the chipping sequence A and the chipping sequence C, they should be orthogonal by design. Okay? And if they are orthogonal, then this inner product will be 0 in the end. Okay, so we have 1, 0 here, because the chipping sequence A and chipping sequence C, if you take the inner product of that, then it will be 0. Now if we have here the inverse of the chipping sequence B and the inner product with the chipping sequence C, then we also already know from our observations that if the chipping sequences B and C are orthogonal to each other, then also the inverse of B and C will be orthogonal. Okay, so again the inner product of this term here will be again 0. Okay, and then also we've seen by observation that if we take the inner product of C and C, then the inner product of that will be 1. Okay, so what remains is this 1 here. So overall we get, after despreading the signal, we get 1. So if we despread the signal S using the chipping sequence C, by calculating the inner product of S and C, we will have a 1 in the end. And this is exactly what we expected, because you have seen on the channel C, we send the chipping sequence C, which corresponds to a 1-bit. So it actually worked out. So since these chipping sequences here are orthogonal and these chipping sequences are orthogonal, by calculating the inner product, what remains of them is basically 0. So the signal sort of cancels out, and what's remaining is only the signal of the channel C. Okay? Okay, so we can also apply that to our other scenarios that we have already introduced. So we've introduced the 6 scenarios here. And we can also see how the receiver can decode now the information from the channel C using these 6 scenarios. Actually, we'll only use a subset of these scenarios, then you should get the idea. So maybe first scenario is anyway a little bit boring. So here we only have the sender C active. So you see here A and B are silent, D silent, C is transmitting a 1-bit. So that would mean here the sum would be only the chipping sequence of C. And then what we do here for despreading, if we calculate the inner product of S1 and C, it's actually the inner product of C and C. And there we already know that should be 1. So this first scenario here is anyway a little bit boring. Maybe let's have a closer look at a second scenario here. There's the sender B and C, both of them are transmitting a 1-bit. That means what we should get as a sum here, this is the sum of the chipping sequences non-inverted of B and C. Let's quickly check whether this is correct. Remember, first chip is a -2, second chip is a 0. Let's maybe first check these 2 chips here at the beginning. So let's go back a little bit. Here we have the chipping sequence of B, the chipping sequence of C. First chip added up, -1 plus -1 is -2. That seems to be correct. Second chip added up, -1 plus +1 is 0. So if we go back here, we see this is also correct. So we have a 0 here. The rest of the chips I leave up to you, but seems like at least the first 2 chips, they are calculated correctly. So we can assume safely maybe that the sum S2 is calculated correctly. So what does the receiver now do? The receiver is calculating the inner product of S2 and C. And here on the right hand side we see what the inner product actually should be. So let's also quickly maybe verify that, maybe also using here the first two chips, 2 and 0. So here we have S2. Here we have the chipping sequence of C. We already know this is the chipping sequence of C because here in the first scenario only C was transmitting and was transmitting a 1-bit. So that should actually be the chipping sequence of C. Now let's multiply here this -2 by -1. What do we get? 2. So this is exactly the 2 that we see here. Okay. Then we have a 0 here. That's easy. Multiplying anything by 0 should remain 0. So we have a 0 here. Same here and there. 2 more zeros there. Next one, we have a +2 multiplied by a +1. So what do we get? +2. Okay, seems to work out. Okay, so I think this term here, this should be correct. Then we divide it by the chipping sequence length, 8. So what do we get here? 2 plus 2 is 4, plus 2 is 6, plus 2 is 8. Divided by 8 is 1. Okay, perfect. So we put in a 1, so C send a 1. And we also get, after despreading, we get back a 1. So also works out here for the second scenario. Now I leave as a homework or exercise to you going through the other scenarios, S3 to S6 here. But I think you got the idea. So if chipping sequences are orthogonal, their signals will cancel out. So by multiplying it with the chipping sequence of the channel that you actually want to receive, you will just delete all the signals that you do not want to receive. And what remains is only the signal of the channel that you actually want to receive. And then it's only a question, did you send a 1-bit or a -1 or 0-bit, whether you send a chipping sequence or the inverted chipping sequence. And we already know the inner product of, for instance here, C and C is 1, of C and C inverted is -1. So that is what remains, only the signal of the channel that you actually want to decode. So, seems to work out fine. Okay, now of course you ask yourself, is there a method for creating orthogonal codes? So orthogonal codes where the chipping sequences are pairwise orthogonal. Okay? So of course there is, and I will show you one of these methods called the Welch-Hadamard matrix or the Welch code, which is defined recursively. So in every recursion step, we can create longer and longer codes, chipping sequences, which can serve more and more concurrent senders. Okay? So we start with a single sender only, and this gives us a very small matrix with only one column and one row, with only one value, and this is the value number 1. Okay? So the rows of the matrix, these are actually the chipping sequences. Now we only have one row here, so we only have one chipping sequence, and the chipping sequence here is 1. Of course, the big disadvantage of this very simple matrix here is we only have one chipping sequence, so we can only have one concurrent sender. Yeah? The good news is this one sender gets the whole bandwidth of the complete channel. Okay? So, however, we want to talk about multiplexing, so typically we want to have multiple concurrent senders. So how can we create codes for multiple concurrent senders? We can do that recursively. So we can double the number of possible concurrent senders by creating the next bigger matrix using the previous size matrix. So for instance here in that example, we take this matrix here and we plug in the values of this matrix at the top left in a non-inverted form, at the top right in a non-inverted form, at the bottom left in a non-inverted form, and at the bottom right in an inverted form. Okay? So if we had here the 1 in that matrix, then the next bigger matrix would use the 1 here on the top left, the 1 on the top right, the 1 on the bottom left, and a -1, so negated, the previous matrix negated, at the bottom right. Okay, that gives us the next bigger matrix, which now has already 2 rows, and these 2 rows are actually 2 chipping sequences which are orthogonal to each other, with double the length of the previous chipping sequences. Okay, so now we have 2 chips. Previously we only had 1 chip. That also means that we can now serve and have 2 concurrent senders at a time. However, every sender only gets half of the bandwidth of the channel. Okay, so we have double the number of senders concurrent senders, but every sender has only half of the bandwidth and half of the data rate then available, okay? Now you might say, okay, 2 concurrent senders is not enough. Let's create maybe more chipping sequences for, let's say, 4 senders. It turns out that this recursive construction will always double the number of concurrent senders in each step. So in each step we will create double the number of chipping sequences. So the next step would be, we take this matrix here, plug it in a non-negated form at the top left, at the top right, at the bottom left, and in negated form here at the bottom right. So 1, 1, 1 minus 1, you see it here, here, and here at this place. And here at this place you see minus 1, minus 1, minus 1, and 1. This is the negated version of this matrix here. Okay? So same construction principle as before. We just take the previous matrix and plug it in a non-negated form 3 times, and here at the bottom right in a negated form. So now we have already 4 chipping sequences, means we can serve and have 4 concurrent senders at a time. However, every sender only gets a fourth of the complete bandwidth of the channel. Okay, so bandwidth again goes down, or the data rate of the different senders goes down. It's half of the previous step, but you have double the number of concurrent senders. And again, the different rows here, they have the orthogonality property. That means these are orthogonal codes that you can now use for the spread spectrum technology as we have discussed before. Okay, now of course you can create bigger matrices, and the next one would have then 8 orthogonal codes, then 16, so it always doubles in each step, and the bandwidth will always be halved in each step for each sender. Okay, so I think you got the idea. Okay, so from the previous construction you might have seen that all the senders get chipping sequences of the same length. At the same time, this means that all the senders have the same bandwidth share available. So you could say it's a fair bandwidth sharing, because everyone has the same share of the total bandwidth available, because everyone has the same chipping sequence length. So the same spreading factor, you could say. Okay? So in some applications, this fairness might not be desired. For instance, if you think about a multimedia application, then some senders might only have to send an audio stream, and other senders might want to send an audio and video stream. So the senders with an audio and video stream, they actually need more bandwidth than the senders only send in an audio stream. Okay? So the question is then, is it possible to define an orthogonal code where we can give to different senders different bandwidths by assigning them chipping sequences of different length? So is that possible? And of course, the different chipping sequences all need to be orthogonal to each other. Although they have different length, they all need to be orthogonal to each other. So is that possible? And it turns out that using exactly the Welch-Hadamard matrix or codes, it's actually possible. So here you see actually the Welch code in a tree form. So it's exactly the same codes as we have seen before, only a little bit rearranged and reordered and put into a tree form. That means here on the left hand side you see the smallest matrix, then here you see the next bigger matrix, and here you see the next bigger matrix. However, you have to be aware that the rows here, they have been reordered actually. Here it's the same still as before, but actually here these rows have been reordered compared to the previous slide where I've shown to you the matrix, okay? Still, these are exactly the codes that come from these matrices that you have seen before. So naturally, all the codes here are orthogonal to each other. And also these codes here are all orthogonal to each other, because actually that's the matrix that we have seen before. Yeah? However, what we want to do now is we want to assign to different senders chipping sequences of different length. For instance, we want to assign to one sender a chipping sequence of length 4. This one has maybe not such a high bandwidth demand, such a high data rate necessary for this sender. Maybe it's only sending an audio stream. And to another sender, we want to assign maybe a shorter chipping sequence of length 2 only, because then this sender would have a higher data rate, because it can send double the number of bits in the same time as a sender with a chipping sequence of length 4. Okay, so however, in order for that to work, all the chipping sequences that we assign need to be orthogonal again to each other. Although they might be of different length. Yeah? So, okay, how can we do that? So the trick is in the construction of the tree. We put all the codes that are not orthogonal to each other into one line, into one branch. Yeah? For instance, if you look at this code here, 1, 1, and this code here, 1, 1, 1, 1, then you directly see that here this code is a part of that code here and there. So basically, from the point of view of the chipping sequence of length 4, this is nothing else than here this chipping sequence 2 times after each other. So it's certainly not orthogonal. Huh? However, also, if you look at this chipping sequence here, it's also not orthogonal. Why? Because again, we see this chipping sequence here, and then the inverted chipping sequence from here again. Yeah? So since the inverse of this chipping sequence is also not orthogonal, again, these two chipping sequences, this one here and this one here, cannot orthogonal to each other. Now, what does that mean for the assignment of chipping sequences to different senders? This actually means that we must never assign chipping sequences from the same branch and use chipping sequences from the same branch concurrently. Okay? That means what it's not allowed is to assign to one sender this chipping sequence and to another sender this chipping sequence here. However, what is allowed is that we assign to the different senders chipping sequences from different branches. This is allowed because these codes are certainly orthogonal to each other. So naturally, of course, these codes are all orthogonal to each other by design of the matrix, and also these codes here. However, also this code here is orthogonal to that code here, and this code here is orthogonal with these two codes here. Yeah? So this is interesting now, because now we could assign to the audio stream, we could assign maybe this chipping sequence here, and to the audio video stream, we assign this sequence here. And that would work because actually really these codes are then orthogonal to each other. So this 1, 1 is orthogonal to 1, minus 1, and again to 1, minus 1. And it's also orthogonal to minus 1, 1. So basically you see here also that these codes are orthogonal to each other. Okay, so that is allowed. We just have to select chipping sequences from different branches, and then they can also have different length depending on the bandwidth demand and data rate demand of the senders. Okay, so this is the tree form. Very important for us if we want to assign different bandwidths to different senders and chipping sequences of different length to different senders. So actually what's presented here in the next 2 slides, I've already said. However, I want to show to you in more detail now how we construct this tree here. I've already told you this is just a reordering of the matrices that we have seen before. However, I also want to show you how to actually very easily construct this tree here. Okay, and this is what I want to show next. Okay, so next I want to show you how to construct this conflict tree with the conflicting chipping sequences organized in tree form, such that a parent is always, let's say, in conflict with its child elements. And in order to show you that, first of all, I will show you again the Welch-Hadamard matrix, which you already know looks like this. We start on the first level with a 1. And then we take here this one element, copy it 2 times to the upper part of the matrix, copy it once again to the lower part of the matrix, and then once again in a negated form here to the last element. So this is then basically the second level. If we do that once again, then again we have to copy exactly this matrix here, as is, in a non-negated form, to the upper left element, to the upper right element, to the lower left element of the matrix, and to the lower right. But here to the lower right in negated form. That means we have to negate it now. -1, -1, -1, and 1. So this here is a negated form of that. And these, and these are exactly the previous matrix. So this is basically the next level of the Welch-Hadamard matrix. So what did we actually do here? Let's look for a pattern, and this pattern we will also use then later on for constructing our conflict tree. So first of all, we see here this one. We basically copied it here, here, and here, and negated form there. That means this was a straight copy, this was another copy, and a negated copy. Okay, so this is what we obviously did here on the first level. So for the second matrix here, we did basically the same thing. We have here 1, 1, which appears here and there. So we just copied this 1, 1 over there and over there. Copied it once again in non-negated form over there and in negated form down here. So this was then negated. So 1, 1 was copied here, again in non-negated form there, once again here, and then in negated form again here. Same for this element here. 1 minus 1 is copied 2 times here and there, in non-negated form here and there, and in negated form here again. Okay, there seems to be a rule, construction rule behind that. And exactly this construction rule we will now use for building our conflict tree. We just have to make sure that the child elements, the child chipping sequences, they are basically the ones which are in conflict with the parent chipping sequence. And this is what we exactly also see here already. 1, 1 is in conflict with that chipping sequence 1, 1, since it's not orthogonal. Second part here, same thing. This thing is not orthogonal to that one here. 1, 1, 1, 1 again, not orthogonal. Same here, 1, 1 again, not orthogonal to 1, 1 here. And minus 1, also not orthogonal to this one here. So obviously these things, this here should be the parent, and these elements should be the child elements. Same here, this should be the parent, this should be the child elements. So now we can really build our tree. We start with a 1 here. We have 2 children for 2 other chipping sequences with double the length of the parent chipping sequence. We copy the 1 here and there, copy it once again in non-negated form there, and once again in negated form here. This is exactly what we see here. Yeah? We have the 1, we copied it here and there, in a non-negated form to the upper right, in a negated form to the lower right. This is exactly what we did here. Now for the next level, we also go on like this. We copy the parent chipping sequence to both of its children, then once again in non-negated form to the upper child and in negated form to the lower child. So this is exactly what we did also here. 1, 1 was copied here, and it was once again copied there. 1, 1 was copied here, and in negated form over there. So just in a different order. This was the first and third row. Now it's the first 2 rows here in the tree. And now here for the lower part exactly the same. We copy 1 minus 1 to both children. Then once in non-negated form here, and in negated form here to this part. Minus 1 and 1. And again we see this is exactly what we have here. 1 minus 1, 1 minus 1, 1 minus 1, 1 minus 1. So same here. And the last row here, this is exactly this here. Huh? So I think now you know the trick. You can do it maybe once again. Copy it to the upper child, copy it to the lower child. Once again in non-negated form at the upper child, and in negated form at a lower child. So you can go on like this to build our conflict tree, where the children, the chipping sequences of the children are actually always in conflict with the parent. Because you see here, this 1, 1 here is in conflict with that chipping sequence, with that one here, with that one here, and with that one here. And it's exactly the same sequences in the end, only in a different order than for the Welch-Hadamard matrix. Okay? That's basically all. Okay, so let's next do a little example where we assign chipping sequences of different lengths to different senders, because maybe the senders have really different bandwidth demand. Okay, so let's assume here we have 3 different senders, A, B, and C. And let's assume that maybe A has the highest bandwidth demand, and B and C, they have lower bandwidth demand, half the bandwidth demand and data rate demand in A. But B and C have the same bandwidth demand actually. Okay, so here A has the highest bandwidth demand and B and C have the same bandwidth demand, each other, however, only half of A. Okay? So that means that A can send 2 bits in the same time that B and C only send 1 bit. Okay? So in order to make that happen, we have to assign to A sequence, a chipping sequence of half the length of the chipping sequences of B and C. So you see here, B and C, they have chipping sequences of double the length as A. Okay, that also means that A can send in the same time double the number of bits, because every bit here has only 2 chips and every bit here has 4 chips in length. Okay? So what are valid choices for these 3 different senders? So you already see here we have chosen or made a good choice. So I have chosen here the chipping sequence 1, 1 for the sender A. Maybe let's go back here to our tree form. So we've chosen a chipping sequence 1, 1 for the sender A. That means we can choose these 2 chipping sequences for the senders B and C. However, we must never choose these chipping sequences because these 2 are not orthogonal to this one here, as already shown. However, these 2, they are orthogonal here to the sender A using chipping sequence 1, 1. So what we can use is 1, minus 1, 1, minus 1, and 1, minus 1, minus 1, 1. And this is exactly also what we did here, as you see here. Okay? So now B and C, they are both sending a 1 bit, and A is sending in the same time a 1 bit followed by another 1 bit. So double the amount of data in the same time. So double the data rate. So this gives us a spread signal that looks like this here. So here 1, 1, 1, 1, it's just a chipping sequence 2 times. And here it's the chipping sequences assigned to B and C, each time only 1 time. Okay. So these spreaded signals also add up again in the air to give a sum of signals, which is actually depicted here. Okay. So after despreading, we again get back here the original bit sequence, here 1, 1, 1 here and 1 there, by multiplying again with here the chipping sequence of the senders. So here we multiply by the chipping sequence of A, so this was 1, 1, 1, 1. And here we multiply by the chipping sequence of B, 1, minus 1, 1, minus 1, and the chipping sequence here of C. Yeah? And we always multiply the sum of signals here, so this part here, we multiply by the chipping sequence. Only here for the sender A, of course, we take first of all the first 2 chips and multiply these by the chipping sequence of A, because the chipping sequence of A has only 2 chips. Yeah? Again, calculate the inner product here. So this is the despreading that we do, and again we get back the 1 bit and the 1 bit. So you can do the math here and then just calculate that, and you see it will work. Same here, also here it works, and also there it works. So this is an example now where we used really different bandwidths for different senders and assigned them different chipping sequences of different lengths. But we have made sure that these chipping sequences are orthogonal by choosing them from different branches in our tree. Okay? Now, if we made an invalid choice, I can also show to you that it actually wouldn't work anymore. So for instance, here we have given the sender A the chipping sequence 1, 1, and we have given the sender B the chipping sequence 1, 1, minus 1, minus 1. So if we go back to our tree, you see now we have given the sender A here the chipping sequence here, and the other sender, I think, this chipping sequence here. Okay? So you see they come from the same branch. Yeah? So this is not allowed because these codes are not orthogonal. And now if we do here again the example and complete the example, we see here the signal that is the sum of the signals sent out here. So these are the spreaded signals of the sender A and B. Then the sum of these would be these values here. And now if we do the despreading by using exactly again the inner product as we have done before, and the same calculations as we have done before, we would multiply here 2, 2, the first 2 chips, by 1, 1, and divide that by 2, that would be 4 divided by 2, and the result would be 2. Now, what does 2 actually mean? The only valid things that we would expect here is either 1 or minus 1. So 2 is an invalid number that should never occur. And now we are not sure anymore, is 2 now really a 1 bit or is it a 0 bit? If it was a minus 1, it would be clear, but 2 is not really clear. Yeah? And if you do the despreading here for the second part, the result is even 0. So 0, this is really now completely strange. What does 0 actually mean? Is 0 now, 0 is certainly not 1, and 0 is certainly also not minus 1. So it's somewhere in the middle. However, we can only have the bits 1 and 0. That's obvious. So 1 and minus 1 would be valid outputs. However, 0 must never be an output, exactly as 2. 2 must never be an output of this calculation here. So you see, if you choose the wrong chipping sequences, made the wrong choices by choosing chipping sequences from the same branch, then we have a problem. Then the despreading doesn't work anymore. And this is what I wanted to show you here. Okay? Okay, so we've seen now how to use orthogonal codes to implement direct sequence spread spectrum technology. So let's continue with a little discussion about the advantages and disadvantages of this technology. So first of all, one big advantage is that all the senders and all the transmitters can use the same frequency. So we don't need to change the frequency at all. At the transmitters, we use the complete bandwidth and we always send on the same sender frequency. So that's basically very simple and very easy to implement. Second big advantage is that we can have different data rates at the different senders by using chipping sequences of different length. We can also have fair bandwidth sharing by giving everyone the same chipping sequence length. However, we can also give different senders different chipping sequence lengths, and then we have different data rates available for the different senders, which might be quite handy, for instance, for multimedia application, like someone sending only audio, some other one sending audio and video, and so on, and different quality levels maybe. Then we can do that and implement that by different chipping sequence lengths. And we have seen these codes. And third here, the whole system, the direct sequence spread spectrum technology, is robust against narrowband interferences. I mean, that's the whole idea why we did the whole thing, why we did the spreading. So why we did a spreading of a narrowband signal to a broadband signal, where then a narrowband interference would only have a little bit of disturbance to the complete signal. So we still can recover, hopefully, the signal that the sender did actually send. Okay, so this is the advantages. Now, what are the disadvantages, or I should say maybe challenges that we have to face here? So first of all, we need to synchronize the senders and receivers such that the chips sent by the different senders arrive at the receiver side at the same time. We always, here on a piece of paper, we have added up the first chips from all the senders, then the second chips of all the senders, and so on. So we always added up the same chips from the different senders. So first chips, second chips, third chips, and so on. So this works very nicely on a piece of paper, but in reality, the senders have a different distance to the receiver. So their signals will also arrive at a different time at the receiver side. So there's also a speed of light restriction still for the senders here. So no one can trick physics here. So that also means that a sender who is having a greater distance to the receiver might need to send earlier or starts transmitting earlier such that its chips arrive at the receiver side at the same time as a sender who is very close to the receiver. Okay? So we need to estimate the distance and adapt the time of sending at the sender side. So that requires synchronization. I will not discuss synchronization here in detail. You can go to the distributed systems lecture, for instance, and then see how such methods actually work. Second thing is, all the signals should have the same signal strength at the receiver side. That means that the different senders need actually to send possibly with different signal strengths, with different transmission power, depending on their distance to the receiver. Because we have already seen that with the distance, the signal gets weaker and weaker. And again, a sender who is very distant from the receiver needs to send with a stronger signal strength, a stronger transmission power, than maybe a sender which is very close to the receiver. So we need power control. We need maybe an open or closed loop system to control the power of the senders such that at the receiver side, all the signals arrive with the same signal strength. Otherwise, the whole addition that we did here will again not work so easily. So we always made the assumption that 1 plus 1 is actually 2, for instance. Yeah. However, if the signals have different strength, then maybe at the receiver side, a 1 suddenly looks like an 0.8 or so. Yeah. Then we add up 0.8 plus 1 or something like this, and suddenly our whole calculations will not work so easily anymore. In the end, we don't have a 1 and minus 1 as an outcome, but we have maybe an 0.9 as an outcome or so. Well, what does that actually mean? Yeah? So yeah, we should control the transmission power of the different senders. This is again some complexity that will add more complexity to the whole system, to the senders and the receivers. Okay. Now let me finish with a quick example what happens if the senders and receivers are not really synchronized. That means if their chips arrive at their receiver side not synchronized, not at the same time. So I will end with that little example to show you that things will go wrong if actually senders and receivers are not really synchronized. Okay? Okay, let us look at an example where the senders are not synchronized. So the chipping sequences arrive at different points in time at the receiver side. So here we have a Welch-Hadamard code with a chipping sequence of 4 chips. So 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 minus 1, 1 minus 1, 1, 1 minus 1 minus 1, and 1 minus 1 minus 1, 1. We're not using all these chipping sequences for our example. We're only using 2 senders, S1 and S2. S1 has the chipping sequence 1 minus 1, 1 minus 1. And S2 has the chipping sequence 1 minus 1, minus 1, and 1. We assume that sender S1 wants to send a bit sequence 1, 0. And sender S2 wants to send a bit sequence 1, 0, 1. Now I've already said that the senders S1 and S2 are not really synchronized such that their bit sequences, their chip sequences, arrive at a receiver side at different times. So we assume that a signal of S2 arrives 2 chip times earlier at the receiver than the chipping sequence of S1. That means S2 is 2 chip times ahead of the sender S1. Okay, now let's do our example. Let's send these bit sequences here. So we start with the sender S1. Sender S1 wants to send a 1 bit first. A 1 bit means that we need to send the chipping sequence as it is. So 1 minus 1, 1 minus 1. I start now here, since later on we'll see I have to do that because the sender S2 has to start a little bit earlier. So I start here 2 chips, let's say to the right. And now we send the 1 bit here, translating to 1 minus 1, 1 minus 1 as chipping sequence. That means we can insert it here, 1 minus 1 and 1 minus 1. So next bit to send is a 0, so we have to invert the chip sequence. So this would then be minus 1 and 1, and minus 1 and another 1. So this is basically the chipping sequence that S1 is sending. Now looking at S2, S2 is 2 chips or 2 chip times ahead of S1. So we have to start here. S2 wants to send a 1. So we have the chipping sequence here, 1 minus 1 minus 1 and 1. So we send a 1, minus 1, minus 1 and 1. Then S2 wants to send a bit 0. So that would translate to minus 1, 1, 1, minus 1. So minus 1, 1, 1, minus 1. And last but not least, it wants to send again a 1 bit. So that would translate to 1, minus 1, minus 1, and 1 as a chipping sequence. So 1, minus 1, minus 1, and 1. Okay, so the interesting section I want to look at is actually here in the middle. So basically what happens to the signal of S1. So for that we have to sum up the signals at the receiver side. So this is basically here the last row. So we see it's 1 plus minus 1, that's 0. Minus 1 plus 1, that's also 0. Minus 1 plus 1, it's again 0. Minus 1 plus 1, again 0. Minus 1 plus 1, again 0. So not very surprisingly, now we only have here a 0 signal at the receiver side. So no matter with what chipping sequence we multiply now this signal here, it will always remain 0. And that's of course a problem now. So you see already here, we cannot reconstruct the signal of S1 anymore by multiplying with its own chipping sequence, since we have basically here the 0 signal, which we multiply by anything will be again 0. So here you see we really have a problem if the senders S1 and S2 are not really synchronized. This is of course an extreme example where we really have only zeros in the end, but this really shows the problem. If the senders are not synchronized, then such scenarios can happen and we cannot reconstruct and filter out the own signal anymore, or signal of a specific sender anymore at a receiver side. So it's very crucial that the senders here S1 and S2 are synchronized such that their chipping sequences that they send out are really in sync. So this sender S2 must start here, then everything would be fine. You can check that out. You can try the example for yourself with synchronized senders, but you can already see if the senders are not synchronized, then we get such problems here where we cannot really receive the signal anymore and reconstruct the signal anymore at the receiver side. Okay, so this is what I wanted to show here. Okay, so our journey through the spectrum technologies wouldn't be complete without having a quick look at Wi-Fi. So I have here my laptop, and my laptop is of course using Wi-Fi. It's using Wi-Fi in the 5 GHz ISM band. Therefore, we're also looking here at the 5 GHz ISM band. Actually, the laptop is using the channel 48, and the channel 48 has a center frequency of 5.24 GHz. So it is exactly the middle of that channel. The channel has a bandwidth of 20 MHz, so 10 MHz to the left, 10 MHz to the right. So it goes here from 5.23 GHz up to 5.25 GHz. So from here to here, this is actually then the channel 48 used by my laptop. And now we can already see here the transmissions. So these horizontal lines here, these are transmissions of the laptop or the access point communicating with the laptop. So we see that these transmissions, they actually really span the complete channel. So from these horizontal lines, we could have the idea certainly that this is a spread spectrum technology using up the complete bandwidth by the signal of the complete channel. Okay, so having said that, we have to be a little bit careful here because actually by just looking at this waterfall display, it's very hard to say which technique is actually really used here. So it could be, of course, a direct sequence spread spectrum technology as used by the Wi-Fi system, or it could be a frequency hopping scheme, a fast one that is basically so fast that here the time resolution is not sufficient to tell that in these horizontal lines we actually have hopping between the different channels, so between different frequencies. So here then the time resolution wouldn't be enough for that. Or it could also be a novel technology like orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. There you hear already in the name, it's frequency division multiplexing, which we also have already discussed, but a special one, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. So what does that mean? Basically they divide here the whole bandwidth of the channel into subcarriers at different frequencies, therefore frequency division multiplexing. So we have several frequency bands here within a channel. And then we spread the signal, or we distribute the signal across these different subcarriers. And the subcarriers have this orthogonal kind of property that make overspeaking between the subcarriers less severe, let's say. So it's more robust. But basically, no matter which kind of technique we really use here, I said it's hard to tell just now from this figure here, or from this display. The idea of all of these technologies, basically from an abstract point of view, is very similar. So we do not want to have these narrowband interferences. We want to robust against them, and then we would say that every signal that is spread across the whole channel bandwidth is less prone to errors because of a narrowband interference somewhere at a certain spot within that channel. So we have a good chance of decoding our signals still, even if there was maybe some disturbances here, narrow band within that channel. So that's similar for all these technologies. However, as said before, I cannot really tell you now this is the one or the other just by looking at this waterfall model here. Okay, but we see basically the whole bandwidth of that channel is used up and the signals are really distributed across the whole channel. Okay? Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. So this time we discussed spread spectrum technologies, namely frequency hopping and direct sequence spread spectrum. We also briefly discussed use cases for it, namely the Bluetooth technology and also briefly Wi-Fi. So next time I want to continue here. I want to present another use case. I want to present cellular communication systems, like for instance a GSM system. And we will see they use different multiplexing techniques. So stay tuned. See you next time and take care. Bye bye.